It's late afternoon in France, February 12th, 1945. The sun's already sinking behind the trees, and the air has that sharp, cold bite that seeps into your bones. In the wooded hills near Epernay, a 22-year-old American infantryman named Jack Bigham lies face down in the dirt, his cheek pressed against the frozen ground. He's part of the 2nd Battalion, 3rd Infantry Regiment, 4th Infantry Division of the U.S. Army. A sniper, or at least, that's what his commanding officer calls him. The smell in the air is a mix of gunpowder, pine, and damp earth, the scent of a battlefield that's been alive for too long. In Jack's hands rests his rifle, a Springfield M1903A4, standard issue for American snipers back then. But there's one thing about it that's anything but standard: the scope mounted on top. It's not Army equipment. It's not something he was issued. It's something he built himself. And that's where this story really begins. When Jack first showed the rifle to the other guys in his platoon, they burst out laughing. They'd never seen anything like it. The scope looked cobbled together because it was. Jack had made it from the broken remains of a medical microscope, the kind you'd find in a hospital lab, not on a battlefield. He'd used a steel ring from a busted German artillery fuse to hold it in place, and hand-marked the dials himself using pencil notches. It looked ridiculous, like something out of junk pile. One soldier joked, "What's that, Bigham? You gonna diagnose a germ or shoot a kraut with that thing?" Another called it Jack's toy. Even the sergeant rolled his eyes. "That contraption'll shatter on your first shot," he muttered. But Jack didn't argue. He just smiled a little, adjusted the mount, and kept quiet. Because he knew something they didn't, it worked. It wasn't perfect, but it was his. And sometimes, that's enough. Now, here he is, a week later, lying in the cold mud with that same homemade scope glinting in the pale French light. The war has brought him here, to a ridge overlooking a valley crawling with German armor. A Panzer IV tank sits more than 1,200 yards away. That's nearly 3/4 of a mile, and its crew is refueling, thinking they're safely out of range. They're not. Jack exhales slowly. He lines up the crosshairs, his crosshairs, on a single exposed jerry can strap to the back of the tank. One breath, one squeeze. The rifle cracks once across the valley. At first, nothing. Then, boom, a flash of orange. Then a wall of fire. The tank's rear erupts. The engine compartment lights up, and within seconds the whole thing is an inferno. The sound rolls across the valley like thunder trapped in metal. Every soldier who had laughed at Jack's toy stares in disbelief. No one says a word. That wasn't artillery. That wasn't an airstrike. That was one man with one bullet and one scope he built with his own hands. In that moment, nobody's laughing anymore. That's where the legend of Jack Red Bigham begins, a quiet Kansas mechanic turned sniper who refused to accept the limits of what he was given. This isn't just a story about a miracle shot. It's about doubt, creativity, and the stubborn belief that sometimes, even in war, the best weapon you can have is your own mind. The winter before that shot, the war was grinding toward its end, but nobody on the ground could feel it. The Battle of the Bulge had just torn through the Ardennes. The men of the 4th Infantry Division were exhausted, frozen, and running low on just about everything: food, fuel, and hope. By February of 1945, they'd pushed east into France's Champagne-Ardenne region, a stretch of dense forest and rolling hills near Epernay. It was beautiful country, or would have been if it weren't littered with shell craters and barbed wire. The 2nd Battalion of the 3rd Infantry Regiment, known to the men simply as 2-3, was tasked with a brutal job: weaken German defenses along the Bois de Lin Ridge, a line of dug-in positions guarding the approach to the Rhine. Among them was Jack Bigham, quiet, steady, and maybe a little odd. He wasn't a career soldier. He wasn't even a hunter back home. He was a mechanic. Jack grew up in Marshall, Kansas, a town so small you could walk from one end to the other before your coffee got cold. He worked in his uncle's watch repair shop, the kind of place where time moves slower than the second hand on the clocks he fixed. He loved the precision of it, the tiny gears, the steady hands, the patience it took to make something work again. Customers used to joke that Jack had ice in his veins. He'd just smile and keep turning his tools. When he was drafted in 1943, he didn't complain. He packed his tools, kissed his parents goodbye, and traded the tick of clockwork for the crack of rifle fire. At Fort Benning, during training, his instructors noticed something different about him. He wasn't just good at shooting, he was methodical. He'd calculate windage, elevation, and bullet drop in his head, like he was working out a math problem. But there weren't enough scopes to go around, and the Army didn't exactly hand out sniper positions to kids from Kansas. So Jack became just another rifleman, until the war and necessity forced him to think differently. By January 1945, the Army was learning the hard way that it didn't have enough trained sharpshooters and even fewer scopes. The few that existed were mostly Weaver 330CS, fragile, fog-prone, and often destroyed in battle. In Jack's entire battalion, there were only 3 scoped rifles. That meant hundreds of men relying on iron sights against enemies who had superior optics and experience. Jack saw a problem, and to him, a problem was just a puzzle waiting to be solved. He started asking around quietly, engineers, medics, supply guys. Anything he could salvage, he did. Then, one night, he walked over to the field hospital, pretending to help move equipment. What he really wanted was broken glass. That's where he found it. A cracked Bosch and Lohm microscope, shattered during transport. To most people, it was junk. To Jack, it was opportunity. He took the lens tube, the focus ring, the eyepiece, and got to work. Over the next 2 nights, Jack turned his tent into a makeshift workshop. He filed metal by hand, soldered parts using a mess kit burner, and used a steel ring from a destroyed German 88mm shell casing to secure the lens tube to his rifle. He worked quietly, wrapping tools in cloth so they wouldn't make noise. He tested angles by candlelight, checking reflection, magnification, and focus. When he finally mounted the finished piece to his Springfield M1903A4, it looked, well, terrible, crooked, scratched, heavy on one side. When he brought it to his squad, they couldn't stop laughing. That thing looks like it came out of Frankenstein's lab, someone said. Even the sergeant smirked. Don't cry when it falls apart, Bigham. But Jack didn't take it personally. He just nodded, shouldered the rifle, and walked out to test it. He found a small clearing west of camp and set up a few rusted helmets on posts, 200 yards out, then 400, then 6. Each night, he'd move farther back, checking how the scope held up. It fogged in the cold, so he coated the glass with a thin film of soap. It stopped the condensation. The image had a faint blue tint, but the crosshairs were steady. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than nothing. And in war, better than nothing can make all the difference. So now we're back to where he started. The ridge near Epernay. The cold air. The Panzer IV sitting across the valley. Jack's scope, his creation, pressed against his cheek. The tank's crew refueling, unaware of the man, watching them through a lens built from scrap. He takes one deep breath, holds it, and fires. The bullet travels almost 1,200 yards before it strikes, and the world explodes. Part 2, the man who built his own crosshairs for a few long seconds after the Panzer erupted. No one said a thing. The only sound was the echo rolling off the hills and the faint hiss of fire in the distance. Jack stayed still, eyes still pressed to the scope, watching the smoke curl into the sky. He didn't smile. He didn't even move. He just exhaled a long, tired breath and muttered, "Guess it works." Behind him, his spotter, a corporal named Eddie Malone, was still frozen, his jaw open halfway between disbelief and a laugh. Eddie finally said, "Jesus Christ, Jack. What the hell was that?" Jack just shrugged, shouldering the rifle. "Homemade optics," he said, like he was describing a fishing lure, not a weapon that had just taken out a tank. Word spread through the line before nightfall. A sniper had hit a Panzer, not the crew, not the tracks, but the fuel supply from over 1,000 yards away. Most soldiers didn't believe it. Some said it must have been luck. But for the men who saw it, who felt the heat from that explosion, there was no doubt. Jack Bigham had made something special. That evening, when the battalion regrouped near Epernay, Captain Harold Winters, Jack's commanding officer, called him into the command tent. Jack walked in expecting a reprimand, maybe for using unapproved gear. Instead, the captain was sitting at a folding table, looking at the rifle lying across his lap like it was a piece of alien technology. He tapped the side of the scope with his finger. You built this yourself? Yes, sir. From what? Jack hesitated. A microscope, sir, from the field hospital. Broken one. Winters stared at him for a long second. Then, finally, you hit a tank from over 1,000 yards? Jack nodded. Was aiming for the gas can. Got lucky. The captain set the rifle down and leaned back. You know, luck doesn't usually blow up German armor, Bigham. He called on the battalion's ordnance officer to look it over. The man picked it up like it might explode in his hands, turning it over, peering through the lens. When he looked up, he just said, well, I'll be damned. It's not regulation, but it's steady. From that moment on, no one told Jack to take his toy apart again. Over the next few weeks, as the 4th Division advanced deeper into eastern France, Jack found himself being requested, not ordered, but asked, to take positions ahead of the line. He was still officially an infantryman, but his commanders started using him like a one-man recon and precision strike team. He didn't ask for it. He just kept doing his job, quietly, efficiently. By early March, his name was being passed around through the ranks. Other units were sending messages asking for the mechanic with the scope. Some wanted him to train their sharpshooters, others just want to look at his rifle. One sergeant in the 22nd Infantry called it the Kansas scope. The name stuck. Jack never called himself a sniper. He didn't like the word. He saw himself as a problem solver with a rifle. If a German machine gun nest pinned down a platoon, he'd crawl out under the cover of dark, find a vantage point, and wait, patient, still breathing in rhythm with the wind. Then one clean shot, and the nest went silent. Sometimes he worked alone, sometimes with Eddie watching through binoculars. But most of the time, he preferred no spotter at all. Fewer moving parts, he'd say. When the men around camp saw him cleaning his rifle, they noticed how carefully he handled the scope. Like it was alive. He'd polish the glass with a torn piece of shirt, check the tension of the ring, realign the zero every morning before first light. He never bragged, never boasted. He didn't have to. By mid-March, word of his homemade scope reached the 4th Division's logistics officer, Major Russell Compton. Compton had a reputation for being practical, the kind of officer who cared less about rules and more about results. He asked to see the rifle. When he did, his first reaction was disbelief. His second was curiosity. How do you even calibrate this thing? He asked. Jack explained, in that calm, steady way of his, how he'd used fence posts for distance, scratched his own range marks, and adjusted for wind by trial and error. Compton nodded slowly. You ever think about making more of them? Jack blinked. With what, sir? I barely had enough for one. Suppose I could get you the parts? That's how it started, a small experiment, right in the middle of a war. A mechanic from Kansas and a major from Supply, scrounging broken optics from field hospitals and downed observation posts, trying to make functional scopes out of scrap. Within a month, they had 4 working models. Not beautiful, not identical, but functional. Compton sent a report up the chain of command. It never reached high command, at least not officially, but a few men in Ordnance Command took notice. They called it an improvised magnification assembly in their notes. Jack just called it a sight. By April 1945, the German front was collapsing. Jack and his unit pushed through to the Moselle River, fighting skirmishes that felt more like desperate resistance than organized defense. One morning near Trier, Jack and Eddie were positioned along a ridgeline, watching a German convoy retreating east. Eddie leaned over and whispered, "You think this thing could hit one of their trucks?" Jack smirked just barely. "Let's find out." One shot, and the lead truck burst into flame. The others scattered. By the time the battalion moved in, they found Jack still lying there, watching through the scope, calm as ever. He had written a small note in his journal that day. It read, "Distance about 1,100 yards wind mild. Scope steady. Not luck this time." When the war finally began to slow, Jack's work caught up with him. He wasn't decorated in some grand ceremony. That wasn't how it went. But his commanding officer called him in one last time before redeployment. "Bigham," Captain Winters said, "the brass doesn't quite know what to make of you. You weren't supposed to build weapons. You weren't supposed to outshoot the supply line." Jack said nothing. Winters smiled faintly. "But hell, son, you probably saved a dozen men doing it. Maybe more." He handed Jack a folded piece of paper, a field commendation for ingenuity under fire. It wasn't a medal. It wasn't fame. But to Jack, it was enough. When the war ended, Jack Bigham went home to Kansas. He didn't talk much about what he'd done. Most people didn't even know he'd served, let alone that he'd built a weapon that outperformed Army equipment. He went back to fixing watches, back to the quiet life. He never built another scope, never picked up another rifle. But years later, when military historians were digging through field reports for 1945, they found something curious, a set of diagrams labeled Field Optics, Bigham type. Rudimentary, handwritten, and signed. And in the early days of the Cold War, U.S. engineers at Springfield Armory started experimenting with new sniper optics, stronger, lighter, easier to calibrate. Some of those early sketches looked eerily familiar. Maybe coincidence, maybe influence. But for those who knew the story, it wasn't hard to imagine where the inspiration had come from. Jack never called himself a hero. He didn't seek glory. He just saw a problem and refused to accept that the tools he had were the best he could do. He proved something bigger than a battlefield moment, that ingenuity doesn't come from rank or orders or even resources. It comes from refusing to give up when something seems impossible. One man, one rifle, one homemade scope that changed everything, if only for a moment. Part 3. The war that stayed in his hands. The train from St. Louis pulled into the station just before dawn. Jack stepped down onto the platform, duffel slung over his shoulder, still wearing the same field jacket he'd worn through France. No crowd waited for him. No brass band, no parade. Just the sound of the train easing away and a single voice, his father's, calling, "Jack." They hugged, awkwardly, like two men unsure how to bridge 2 years of silence. His mother cried quietly. His father said something about being proud. Jack smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. He'd come home, but part of him was still lying in that cold French dirt, cheek pressed to a rifle he built from junk. Back in Marshall, the war felt like it had happened on another planet. The hardware store had new paint. The cafe still sold the same coffee. Kids played in the street like nothing had changed. Jack tried to slip back into it. He reopened the little watch repair shop with his uncle. At first, it felt right. The steady tick of gears, the smell of oil, the satisfaction of making something precise again. But his hands, they weren't the same. They still trembled slightly from years of recoil and cold. And sometimes, when he was working on a balance spring or a gear smaller than a dime, he'd freeze, remembering the weight of his Springfield instead. At night, the quiet didn't stay quiet. He'd wake up sweating, the sound of that single shot echoing in his head, the one that set off the Panzer, the one that burned bright enough to follow him home. Sometimes, he dreamed of fire. Other times, of the scope, the lens cracking, blurring his vision just as he pulled the trigger. He'd sit by the window afterward, watching the empty streetlights, his hands clasped like he was still holding that rifle. His mother once asked if he was all right. He told her he was fine. He wasn't. By late 1946, things began to settle. The nightmares didn't stop, but they dulled. He kept busy. He fixed things, clocks, farm tools, radios, anything with moving parts. People said he had a gift. He said it was just patience. But deep down, Jack knew it was something else. He had spent 2 years in Europe learning to notice the smallest imperfections. A click too sharp, a screw too loose, a wind too strong. That kind of awareness doesn't fade. It just changes shape. Sometimes, when a watch ticked too loud, he'd adjust it by fractions of a degree until it was almost silent. Almost too silent. Like the forest outside Epernay. One afternoon in 1947, 2 men showed up at the shop. They were in civilian clothes, but their posture gave them away. "Mr. Bigham?" "Yes, sir. Mind if we talk a moment?" They introduced themselves as representatives from the Army Ordnance Department. They'd been reviewing wartime field reports and found references to an experimental improvised sniper scope, field manufactured by Private Jack Bigham. Jack frowned. That was a long time ago. The taller one smiled politely. Still, the design caught our attention. They asked questions, lots of them, about materials, lens curvature, stability under recoil. Jack answered carefully, drawing small diagrams on scrap paper. After an hour, They thanked him and left, saying the army might be interested in further consultation. They never came back. But 6 months later, Jack saw a short article in Popular Mechanics about a new generation of ruggedized sniper scopes being tested for military use. The prototype looked familiar. He smiled, just a little, and folded the magazine closed. The years rolled on quietly. Jack never married. Some said he was too private. Others said he just liked being alone. He kept working in the shop, fixing whatever came through the door. Watches, radios, a broken rifle scope once. A hunter had dropped it while out west. Jack fixed it in a day. When a man came to pick it up, Jack just said, "You might want to reinforce that mount." The man nodded, not realizing he was taking advice from a legend no one knew existed. Every now and then, Jack would take long walks out past the fields at sunset, where the light turned the prairie gold and the wind came in steady, predictable waves. He'd stop, close his eyes, and breathe the same way he used to before taking a shot. It wasn't about war anymore. It was about stillness, control, the rhythm of being alive. In the summer of 1953, a car pulled up outside the shop. Out stepped Eddie Malone, his old spotter from the war. Older now, heavier, but that same mischievous grin. "Jack," he said, laughing. "You old son of a gun. I thought you'd fallen off the map." Jack smiled faintly. "Just fixing clocks instead of tanks." They sat out back drinking coffee, talking about France, about the guys who made it and the ones who didn't. Eddie told him he was working as a machinist in Chicago, married, 2 kids. At one point, Eddie said, "You ever tell anyone about that scope?" Jack shook his head. "Wouldn't change anything." Eddie chuckled. "Yeah, but hell, Jack, you built something the army couldn't. You ought to be proud." Jack looked down at his hands, the same ones that had built it, and said softly, "I am. I just don't need anyone else to be." Jack lived the rest of his life in Marshall, quietly, predictably. When he passed in 1979, his obituary was short: John Bigham, watchmaker and U.S. Army veteran, beloved by his community. No mention of the rifle. No mention of Epernay. But years later, a local historian sorting through family boxes found something strange in a cigar tin. 3 photographs, grainy, black and white, showing a young soldier holding a Springfield rifle with a bulky, homemade scope mounted on top. And beside them, a folded page of yellowed paper. At the top, written in pencil, it said, "Microscope lens 12 magnification. Field tested. Works under pressure." At the bottom, one small note in his neat handwriting. "If something's worth doing, it's worth making it your own." Jack's story never made it into textbooks. He wasn't a general or a decorated marksman. But maybe that's why it matters more. He represents the thousands of quiet minds who fought not just with weapons, but with ingenuity, who looked at what they had, saw what was missing, and made something better because nobody else would. The war gave Jack his test. His hands gave him the answer. And though history might have forgotten his name, every time a marksman steadies a modern scope, there's a trace, a faint, invisible line that leads back to a 22-year-old kid in a frozen forest, trusting his own creation more than the standard issue. Perfect will bring it full circle. Part 4 takes us decades later, into the present day, where Jack Bigham's story resurfaces. This part ties emotion with discovery, a historian, a modern sniper, and the ghost of a forgotten invention. The tone becomes more documentary and reflective again, cinematic, goosebump-inducing, the kind of ending that lingers after the credits fade. Part 4, the lens of a forgotten soldier, the old watch shop still stands. Or at least, what's left of it. The sign above the door is faded now. The letters Bigham and Son, watch repair barely visible under a layer of dust and peeling paint. It's quiet inside. The workbench is still there, scarred, oil-stained, littered with tiny screws and watch springs that never found their homes again. For decades, no one came here, until one day, a young local historian named Caleb Hartman pushed open the creaking door. He wasn't looking for treasure, just stories. He'd been researching local veterans for a historical society exhibit called Hometown Heroes. That's when he found the box. A small wooden cigar tin tucked behind a shelf. Inside, 3 black and white photos and that folded, yellowed page with the pencil notes. Caleb almost dismissed it, until he saw the words microscope lens and field tested under pressure. Then the photo, a young man in uniform, holding a Springfield rifle with something odd mounted on top. Something that didn't exist in any Army manual he'd ever seen. Caleb took the photos to the local museum. The curator, a retired Marine named Tom Greeley, studied them for a long time, tracing his finger over the strange contraption fixed to the rifle. "This isn't standard issue," Greeley said. "No, sir," Caleb replied. "That's kind of the point." After a week of digging through military archives and declassified field logs, they found it, buried in a box of wartime ordnance reports for 1945. One small document labeled, Field Optics, Bigham J, PFC Improvised Magnification Assembly Tested Under Live Fire, Champaign-Ardennes Sector, February, April 1945. No signature, no commendation, just that. But for Caleb, it was enough to prove the man in the photo wasn't just tinkering. He was inventing. Months later, Caleb took the story to a friend, Sergeant Matthew Torres, a U.S. Army sniper instructor stationed at Fort Benning. They met at a rifle range on a clear morning. Caleb laid out the photos, the diagrams, and the notes. Torres studied them, squinting under his cap. "This guy made this in 45? Out of a microscope?" Caleb nodded. "In a field hospital." Torres let out a low whistle. "Man, that's wild. You know, the way this thing's mounted, the positioning, the eye relief, the way he compensated for elevation, it's not that far off from modern design. Primitive, yeah, but the fundamentals are there." He paused, looking out at the range. "Every shot we take today owes something to this guy, even if nobody knows his name." Intrigued, Torres and Caleb decided to rebuild it. Using the photos and Jack's hand-drawn notes, they worked with a machinist to recreate the Bigham scope. It took 3 months of trial and error, sourcing vintage parts, matching the curvature of the old Bosch and Lone lenses. When it was finally mounted on a vintage Springfield, a 1903 A4, the replica looked exactly like the one in the photo, heavy, rough, and slightly crooked, but oddly beautiful. They took it to the range. Torres loaded a round, steadied the rifle, and looked through the glass. The image wasn't crystal clear. It had that faint blue tint Jack mentioned in his notes, but worked perfectly. Torres turned to Caleb and said, "This thing shouldn't be this good." They tested it again and again at 300, 600, 900 yards. Each time, the old design held steady. When they reached 1,000 yards, Torres took a deep breath, exhaled, and squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out, cutting through the still air. A few seconds later, clang. Direct hit. Torres lowered the rifle, shaking his head with a smile. That Kansas kid knew exactly what he was doing. A few months later, Caleb was sitting in front of the camera. He was filming a short documentary for the local Veterans Museum, The Mechanic Scope. He said, "You know, when we think of innovation, we picture engineers in labs, inventors with resources, time, and funding. But Jack Bigham built something revolutionary out of broken glass and scraps of steel while being shot at." He paused, looking down at a photo of Jack. And then he went home. Fixed watches. Never told a soul. That's what makes it powerful. He didn't do it for glory. He did it because someone had to. Later that year, Caleb and Torres traveled to France, to the exact spot near Epernay where Jack had made his famous shot. The ridge was overgrown now, the valley quiet. They stood there at sunset, looking out across the same stretch of land Jack had once peered across through his homemade scope. Caleb set down a small plaque at the base of a pine tree. It read, "Jack Red, Bigham mechanic, marksman, and innovator, who built what he needed when no one else would." The wind moved through the trees, soft, steady, almost like breath. Torres stood beside him and said quietly, "If he'd had proper tools, he might have changed the whole field." Caleb nodded. Maybe he already did. The film closes on a montage, images fading from one to another. The old photograph of Jack with his rifle. The replica scope gleaming in the sunlight. A modern Army sniper taking aim through a high-tech optic. A close-up of the reticle, clean, sharp, perfect. Then the narrator's voice comes in, calm and reverent. Every innovation starts as a question. Can this be done better? For Jack Bigham, That question began in a muddy forest with nothing but a broken microscope and a belief that he could make something work. 8 decades later, his spirit lives in every soldier who refuses to settle for good enough. He never sought credit. He never chased glory. He just built a way to see more clearly in a world where clarity was in short supply. The final image fades to black, just a single line of text. The scope was improvised. The vision wasn't.